Dayne did not remember the final blow. After so many nights spent recalling the Tower of Joy, he realized his last memory of that battle was the swirl of dust and the clamor of steel against steel. He remembered how he'd spun Dawn in his hand, striking with lethal grace to give Prince Rhaegar's son, and all Targaryen heirs, one last chance at survival. But Ned Stark had stood firm at the tower's threshold, and the Stark men with him were determined, grim with purpose. Arthur remembered Gerald Hightower falling. His breastplate cleaved open, and Oswell went staggering with a mortal wound. Then there had been a flash in the desert sun, a starburst of light, and nothing. When he woke, he was lying in a small room of roughly cut stone, bandages crusted with dried blood wrapped around his abdomen. The pain was excruciating. Each breath felt like a sword twisting deeper in his ribs. A wiry man with a scarred face, someone Arthur did not recognize, fed him broth, changed his bandages, and said little. Arthur could barely speak. His lips were cracked, and a fever burned in his veins. Whenever he tried to talk, he coughed until the pain forced him into a half-swoon. For days that blurred into weeks, he lay in that makeshift chamber, listening to the drip of water off the rock overhead. The man with the scar sometimes whispered, but his words were always too soft, and Arthur was never sure if they were spoken to him or to the darkness. His strength returned slowly. The scarred man insisted on calling him Ser, and from time to time he gave Arthur news of the war outside, though always in clipped phrases and mostly after long silences. Robert Baratheon sat the Iron Throne now, he said. Viserys Targaryen and his newborn sister had fled across the narrow sea. Ned Stark had retreated north with the infant son of Rhaegar Targaryen, or so rumor suggested. The war was over, Robert's rebellion successful, the Targaryens nearly extinct. In those early weeks, Arthur thought of the Kingsguard vows he had taken, to protect the king and the royal family with all his might, to remain true and unswerving in his duty. He had failed. The man with the scar brought him dry bread and watery wine, not once revealing his name or purpose. Arthur wondered if he was a Sellsword, or simply a desert hermit who had found him while scavenging the Tower of Joy's remains. Had Ned Stark left him for dead, or had the man with the scar spirited him away from the battlefield before Stark could finish the deed? He dreamed often of Rhaegar Targaryen, with sad, dark eyes and a silver harp across his knee. In the dream, Rhaegar told him that honor was a double-bladed sword, that in serving one oath, a knight might be forced to break another. Then the prince would vanish, and Arthur would feel the searing pain of his wound anew. Gradually, he healed enough to stand and walk. His rescuer, who still offered no name, led him out of the cramped chamber and through passages that wound into the heart of the mountain behind the Tower of Joy. The hideaway was an old smuggler's den, cut partially into natural caverns, furnished with nothing but wooden stools, straw mattresses, and a few crates of stale provisions. Arthur discovered his armor in a corner, battered but intact, and Dawn's hilt lay beside it. The pale blade glowed faintly in the torchlight. He was certain it had saved his life more than once. The man with the scar said no words when Arthur knelt by the sword. He simply watched with that unreadable gaze. Only when Arthur was able to mount a horse again did the man with the scar speak. "They think you dead," he said. "Best keep it that way, Ser." Arthur's throat tightened. He should be thankful, but a piece of him bristled. "I am," he paused. "I am Kingsguard," he meant to say, but the words would not leave his lips. If he was Kingsguard, then he was sworn to protect a royal line that no longer truly existed. "I am no one," he finally settled on, in a hoarse whisper. The scarred man nodded. "Where will you go?" Arthur felt an ache deeper than the wound in his side. "North, perhaps," he muttered. He thought of Ned Stark's face, how honorable it had been even in the midst of mortal combat. But he quickly realized that if he rode north, it would be as a fugitive. Robert's men would likely recognize the famous sword of the morning, if not his face. "No," the man with the scar said. "Go south, across the sea. Let the realm forget you." Arthur glanced at Dawn, then looked to the dusty horizon beyond. "Perhaps," he said, yet in the pit of his stomach, He felt an unquenched desire for the justice he had sworn to uphold. A new king ruled in King's Landing, a usurper in Arthur's eyes. He felt no personal malice toward Robert Baratheon, but a vow was not easily broken. Then again, was it so different from the vow he had broken when he failed to defend Rhaegar's children? The nameless man gave him a final meal of roasted lizard and half a skin of wine. Then Arthur departed without any more farewells. The hush of the desert and the swirl of sand gave no answers, and he rode aimlessly for days, mind churning with conflicting loyalties. He felt adrift. Arthur Dayne had once been known as one of the greatest knights in the realm. Now, perhaps the realm believed him long dead. He kept his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, traveling under false names when he could. He took odd jobs as a caravan guard or a wandering swordsman in Dorne, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks. During his travels, he heard countless tales from passing merchants and travelers. How King Robert quarreled with his hand, Jon Arryn, over the crown's debts. How the remnants of House Targaryen now lived in exile. How the Lannisters consolidated power in King's Landing. With every story, Arthur's sense of injustice grew. But he had no allies, no banner. He was a dead man walking. In a dim tavern near the Planky town, he met a crone who read omens in the swirl of wine dregs. She stared at him and said, in a rasping voice, "Your star has not yet fallen. Dawn waits in darkness, but the dawn always comes again." Arthur left her with trembling fingers. For a moment he thought she recognized him. Perhaps she had, but her cryptic message echoed in his thoughts. Dawn was the sword of House Dayne, a symbol of the morning and all that was pure. If he carried it, he carried the very heart of his ancestry. He might hide his face from the realm, but he could not hide from his bloodline. Yet years slipped by, and Robert Baratheon's reign continued. Arthur wandered as far as Old Town, sometimes even the Stormlands, always watchful, always concealed. He no longer wore armor openly, nor did he publicly display Dawn. Instead, he kept the blade wrapped in oiled cloth, never drawing it unless absolutely necessary. Knights who glimpsed it, those rare times, would call him the greatest swordsman they had ever seen, but then he would vanish into the dust before they could ask questions. Rumors spread of a mysterious sellsword whose blade shone like a fallen star, but none seemed to connect him to the old tales of Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning. Over time, however, Arthur grew weary of hiding. His conscience gnawed at him. At every turn, he heard rumors of how the realm floundered under the new monarchy. The crown was drowning in debt. Petty lords bickered for scraps of power. The common folk starved in the streets of King's Landing. Perhaps Robert Baratheon was a good man at heart, but the kingdom required more than a warrior's prowess. It required justice, honor, and the guiding light of true knighthood. Arthur remembered the vow he had made long ago, the vow that had once defined him. He had served the Targaryen dynasty, but the Targaryens were scattered now, and from all he heard, Viserys was a broken shadow of a prince, desperate and vengeful, unworthy of the Iron Throne. Young Daenerys, still a girl, was rumored to have a gentle heart, but she was far across the sea and unprepared to claim the realm. The rightful king, Rhaegar's son Aegon, if the rumors were true that Ned Stark had somehow preserved the boy, remained hidden in the north or perhaps beyond. There was only the faintest whisper that a Targaryen heir might survive. He had no real proof, only fleeting rumors that could have been born of hope rather than truth. Yet knights must cling to hope, or so Arthur believed. So he did something he had never attempted since fleeing the Tower of Joy. He made his way north. He traveled slowly, testing the roads, listening to news. He heard that King Robert and Eddard Stark were still the closest of allies. If the child survived, it would be under Ned Stark's protection, or so some said. Others insisted the boy was dead altogether. Arthur found himself crossing the Red Mountains into the Reach, riding carefully under the guise of a hedge knight. The rolling fields and fertile plains reminded him of all he had fought to protect. The realm was beautiful still, though marred by the seeds of corruption. He paused at inns to hear the talk. King Robert was rumored to be on a hunting spree near Harrenhal, or feasting at Casterly Rock with Lord Tywin Lannister. The small folk grumbled about the tax burdens. The nobility was restive, but no open rebellion stirred. He reached the outskirts of the Neck months later, having evaded many gold cloaks and outriders who might have questioned his identity. In a modest fishing village, he heard new rumors that Eddard Stark seldom left Winterfell, that he was an honorable man through and through, but one weighed down by a secret sorrow. Arthur's pulse quickened. He had to know if the boy, a Targaryen boy, still lived. If so, that child was the rightful heir. Could Arthur stand aside if the child was older now, ready to gather swords in his name? He approached Winterfell under the cover of dusk, slipping through the outskirts of the Wolfswood. There, it was said, men who strayed from the roads might never be seen again. But Arthur was an expert tracker, and he found a vantage point overlooking the castle's gate. Smoke rose from the kitchens, and the smell of roast venison drifted in the air. He watched, shrouded in furs, as guards patrolled the battlements. It was his intention to remain unseen until he could glean more intelligence. Yet fortune or fate or perhaps the gods themselves intervened. On his third night of observation, a small party of riders emerged from Winterfell just before dawn. At their head rode Eddard Stark himself, silent and grim. With him was a young boy, dark-haired, perhaps 10 years of age, and a wolfish direwolf padding at his side. Arthur's heart began to hammer in his chest. Stark's bastard, he thought at first. But then he noted how the boy carried himself with a certain quiet nobility. The lad's eyes glinted with curiosity, and he had an almost haunted look, as if bearing a burden far beyond his years. Could that be Rhaegar's son? Impossible. The child didn't look Targaryen. Arthur's eyes narrowed. Or maybe it was simply the blood of Stark overshadowing the Targaryen heritage. He recalled Lyanna Stark's rumored involvement in these events. So many swirling stories, so many secrets. Perhaps the boy was neither Targaryen nor wholly Stark, but a complicated blending of both. They passed near Arthur's hiding place. Without thinking, he shifted to better see them, and a twig snapped beneath his boot. Immediately, the direwolf's ears pricked. Eddard Stark halted, lifting a hand for silence. The boy tugged at Stark's sleeve and pointed into the trees. Arthur cursed himself for carelessness. He tried to slip away, but the direwolf let out a deep growl, bounding forward. Arthur had no desire to harm the beast, and so he stood his ground, slowly raising his hands to show he held no weapon in them. Stark and the boy urged their mounts forward, swords half-drawn. A handful of Stark men trailed behind, bows at the ready. Arthur could have tried to flee, but he was tired of hiding. He let his hood fall, exposing his face, thinner, more weathered, but unmistakably that of Arthur Dayne. Eddard Stark's eyes went wide. The memory of the Tower of Joy must have struck him like a blow, for his mouth tightened. "You?" Stark breathed. Arthur gave a small inclination of his head. "Lord Stark." The Stark men behind their liege exchanged confused glances. They did not know him, but they sensed the tension. The boy frowned, uncertain. The direwolf advanced, snarling softly, until Stark commanded it to heel. "Are you a ghost?" Stark asked quietly. "I saw you fall." "So did I," Arthur replied, voice low and even. "But I am no ghost. Only a man who survived a mortal wound by luck or fate." Stark swallowed, his gaze flickering to the boy at his side. "If you have come for retribution, I have come for answers," Arthur said. "We parted on uncertain terms. You believed you had cause to kill me, and I would have fought to my last breath in defense of her child." He glanced at the boy, who stared back, perplexed. Arthur's chest tightened. He needed to know if this was the prince or not, but the words would not form on his tongue. Instead, he said, "I have heard rumors that the rightful heir may live. I have come to see if that is truth." The boy's eyes widened. Stark laid a hand on the child's shoulder, as if protective. "We cannot speak of such things in the open," Stark said tersely. He looked at Arthur's clothing, ragged from years on the road. "Come if you will. We can speak in private, and if you pose no threat to my family, no harm shall befall you." Arthur inhaled slowly. He had risked much in coming here. The slightest betrayal by Stark could see him dead or imprisoned. But something in Eddard Stark's eyes told him the man's honor remained unwavering. Very well. They rode back to Winterfell in tense silence. Arthur was given a guest chamber, albeit under careful guard. He submitted to the watchful eyes without complaint, feeling exhaustion settle into his bones. He had traveled so far, and at last he might find the truth he sought. Before midday, Stark summoned him to a private solar. The boy from earlier was not present, though a few of Stark's bannermen stood outside, presumably to guard their lord. When Arthur entered, Ned Stark was seated at a small table, hands folded before him. His face looked older than Arthur remembered, worry lines etched deep around his gray eyes. "If you have come to proclaim a Targaryen king, you are too late," Ned began, his tone guarded. "Robert's rule is secure." Arthur shook his head. "I did not come to fight Robert's armies, only to know if the child lives. The one born of—" He paused, uncertain how Ned Stark's honor might color the story. He had never been certain of the exact parentage. He only knew Rhaegar had placed the Tower of Joy under Kingsguard protection for a reason. "Lyanna," Ned said softly, eyes distant. "My sister. You speak of my sister's son." Arthur's breath caught. So it was true. The child was not purely Targaryen, but half Stark, born from Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark's secret union. Or so the rumors had long suggested. "Yes," Arthur managed. Ned studied him. "He lives. I have raised him as my own, hidden in plain sight. To the world, he is my bastard, Jon Snow." He exhaled slowly, as though shedding a heavy burden by admitting this aloud. Robert must never learn the truth. Arthur felt conflicting emotions churn in his gut. Relief that the blood of Rhaegar Targaryen lived on. Sorrow that the boy was forced to live under a false name. "Why do you hide him from his birthright?" Ned's stare hardened. "You know why, Ser Dayne. If Robert learned that a living Targaryen heir walks these lands, he would see him dead. The war is over, and Robert's hatred for Targaryens runs deep. I will not risk the boy's life. Better to let him grow as a bastard than to claim his rightful throne," Arthur said softly. He couldn't keep the note of anguish from his voice. "Would you see him killed?" Ned snapped, uncharacteristic anger flaring. Then he shook his head. "No, I know you wouldn't. You were one of the noblest knights of the realm, or so my father often said." Arthur sank into a chair, shoulders slumping. "He is the reason I survived. My vow was to protect the prince, to protect the rightful heir. If he still lives, I am still sworn to him. Yet what am I to do if you keep him hidden away, disguised as your bastard?" Ned was silent for a time. He studied Arthur's face with quiet intensity. "Jon is happy here in the north, or as happy as a bastard can be. He has siblings, my trueborn children, who love him. He knows nothing of his heritage, and I cannot burden him with it. Not yet." Arthur bowed his head. "You are determined to keep his parentage secret? Even from him?" "For now," Ned replied. "He is but a boy. One day, perhaps, I will tell him the truth if circumstances allow. But Robert would kill me, kill him, kill all of us if it were revealed too soon. That is the reality." Arthur stared at the small table, its surface scratched and worn. He felt a pang of guilt. This was Lyanna's child, and Rhaegar's, and he, Arthur, had been powerless to protect them during the rebellion. "I see," he whispered. Ned sighed, softening slightly. "The realm can ill afford another war. Houses Lannister and Baratheon would crush any perceived Targaryen threat. Whatever you are planning, Ser Dayne, I would beg you to reconsider. Let the boy grow. Let him learn of the realm's cruelties in time. If a day comes when he must press his claim, let it be when he is old enough to bear that burden." Arthur lifted his gaze. "You ask me to remain silent, to forsake the vow that defines me." "I ask you to let the boy live," Ned said. "He is safe here. That is more precious than all the crowns in the 7 kingdoms." For a long moment Arthur held Ned's stare. He saw the unyielding resolve there, the protective love for the boy. Arthur closed his eyes, feeling the weight of everything. "Very well," he said at last. "I will not reveal his identity. I would sooner die than endanger his life." Ned nodded slowly, relief evident in his eyes. "Thank you," Arthur swallowed. "But I cannot simply vanish. I have spent these years wandering, seeing the realms decay, the injustice, the cruelty of the new order. Robert sits the Iron Throne, yes, but does not rule well. The small folk suffer. Corruption grows. There is no knightly honor in the capital anymore. I have begun to believe the realm needs a king who is also a knight." Ned's brow furrowed. "A king who is a knight?" Arthur exhaled, his throat tight. "It might sound mad, Lord Stark, but I have given my life to knighthood. I was taught that a knight should embody the highest virtues: courage, mercy, honesty, honor. The Targaryen line might still lay claim to the throne, but for now that is impossible without bloodshed." Meanwhile, Robert's reign frays at the edges. If only there was a solution that could unite the realm without tearing it apart. A king who embodies the chivalric ideals, who understands duty above all else. Ned said nothing, letting Arthur's words hang. After a moment, Arthur squared his shoulders, meeting Ned's eyes. "I have spent countless nights tormented by the realm's plight, and I have come to a decision that might be as dangerous as proclaiming a Targaryen heir. But it is a different path. If I, Arthur Dayne, though once Kingsguard, now stand as an anointed knight with a storied name, and if I proclaim myself the rightful king." Stark's mouth opened, shock etched into his features. "You cannot mean this." Arthur's voice grew steadier, fueled by a vision he had scarcely dared voice until now. "I do. Not because I lust for power, but because the realm is in dire need of an ideal it can rally around. I have the blood of ancient kings in my line. House Dayne is older than the Undulls. We hold a legendary seat in Starfall. We command respect. Perhaps we do not rival House Baratheon or House Lannister in wealth or men, but we have the Sword Dawn, a living symbol of the light that dispels darkness. If I declare myself the Night King, not out of arrogance, but out of a sincere vow to serve the realm as only a true knight can, some might follow me. Enough, perhaps, to challenge the rot in King's Landing." Ned could hardly speak. His face went pale. "This is madness. You would pit yourself against Robert's might, and the Lannisters, and likely half the realm that is loyal to the crown. There would be war." Arthur nodded grimly. "War or no, the realm is heading to ruin. If the boy remains hidden, and Daenerys and Viserys remain across the sea, who will champion the people now? It is not Robert. He grows fatter by the year, drowning in wine and debts. Tywin Lannister exerts undue influence. The people cry out for justice. Perhaps an anointed knight, famed in song, believed dead, might inspire them. Or perhaps I will die, and it will come to nothing. But I cannot live with the realm's suffering, nor can I remain idle while the rightful heir is forced to stay a secret." Ned pressed a hand to his forehead, as though battling a headache. "If you do this, Robert will not rest until you are slain. He hates Targaryens, but he will see you as a usurper, an insult to his authority. You are one of the most legendary knights in living memory. People will flock to your cause, and Robert cannot allow that. He will muster an army against you. Then let him," Arthur said, voice tempered with quiet determination. "I will fight for a realm of honor, for a realm where the boy can someday step forward if he chooses, without fear of being murdered. If I fail, then the realm will continue under Robert. But if I succeed, if I can gather enough lords to see the light of a just and noble rule, then perhaps we can spare the realm further chaos." He paused. "Will you stand against me, Lord Stark?" Ned stared at him long and hard. "My oath is to Robert as my king and friend. I cannot betray that oath. But I also cannot deny my respect for you, Ser Dayne. You gave me mercy at the Tower of Joy. Let me leave with my sister's child. You speak of justice, of honor. I do not know if it can triumph in these times, but I know your heart is sincere." Arthur bowed his head. "I will not ask you to break faith with your friend, but I hope you will remain neutral, at least. Let me stake my claim. Guard the boy, Protect him as you have. If I fail, he remains safe in your care. If I succeed, the realm will be stable, and the boy may reveal his heritage when the time is right." A long silence followed. Ned clenched and unclenched his jaw. Finally, he nodded once, curtly. "I cannot pledge my sword, for that would be betrayal. But I will not move against you immediately. If you fail, I only ask that you do not reveal Jon's true parentage to anyone." Arthur put a hand over his heart. "I swear it." So it was done. That very evening, Arthur departed Winterfell, not as a skulking fugitive but with a renewed sense of purpose. He rode south, stopping at scattered villages and holds, gathering men loyal to the memory of the Sword of the Morning. Few recognized him at first, but he showed them Dawn, its pale blade a testament to his identity. Word spread like wildfire across the north and then the riverlands. "Arthur Dayne lives. The Sword of the Morning calls for a kingdom ruled by true knighthood." Some scoffed, others were intrigued. Arthur traveled tirelessly, forging alliances where he could. Lord Hoster Tully, bedridden in Riverrun, would not openly defy King Robert, but he allowed Arthur to speak with knights under Tully banners. Some were moved by Arthur's reputation for chivalry and skill. Others considered him a deluded relic of the old regime. Nevertheless, the seeds of a rebellion began to take root in the hearts of those disillusioned with Robert's inattentive rule. Arthur found himself building a ragtag following of hedge knights, younger sons, and dreamers who yearned for the songs of true heroism. He promised them a realm guided by the virtues of knighthood, not by gold or treachery. In secret, he sent letters to Starfall, the ancient seat of House Dayne. Many in his house had believed him dead, and so the news of his survival shook the Dornish coasts. His sister, Aishera Dayne, whom rumor said had thrown herself from a cliff in despair, had vanished from Starfall's halls years ago. Some whispered she lived in Essos. Others said she was truly dead. Arthur, heart heavy, feared the worst. But his cousin Edric Dayne now ruled as the Lord of Starfall, though still a boy. Edric's regent, the Castellan, did not know what to make of Arthur's letter. But the old caretaker wrote back that House Dayne would always stand by the Sword of the Morning. They would shelter him if he came to them. He did come, after traveling through the tumultuous Dornish passes. Dorne had little love for Robert Baratheon, especially after the deaths of Princess Elia Martell and her children. That resentment festered still, and though Prince Doran Martell was cautious, many lesser Dornish lords saw an opportunity in Arthur Dayne's cause. Here was a legendary Dornish knight, thought lost, proclaiming a kingdom of honor. If it weakened the Iron Throne, they might support him. Some hoped it might avenge Elaya's murder by the Lannisters. In time, Arthur's presence in Dorne roused even Prince Doran's interest. Private meeting was arranged at Sunspear. Doran, pale and frail, sat in a sunlit courtyard, his face unreadable. Arthur knelt respectfully, greeting him. The Prince of Dorne studied Arthur in silence for a long moment before speaking. "I recall the day you left for the Tower of Joy with Prince Rhaegar's blessing," Doran said softly. "We heard you died there, but here you stand, seeking a throne." Arthur lifted his head. "I do not seek it for personal gain. I seek it because the realm cries out for justice. House Martell lost Elia and her children to cruelty. House Targaryen is exiled. Robert's line is corrupted by the Lannisters. The realm is filled with turmoil. I offer a different path, one guided by the knightly code, the path Rhaegar once dreamed of, a realm of compassion, fairness, and unity." Doran's lips curved in a slight smile. A lofty dream. Rhaegar had his dreams, too, and they led him to a tragic end at the Trident. "Why should I trust you to succeed where he failed?" Arthur's hand tightened on the hilt of Dawn. He remembered how Rhaegar's death had shattered so many hopes. "I cannot guarantee success, but my vow is unbreakable. I will not become another tyrant, nor will I let the Lannisters' gold overshadow justice. I will champion Dorne's grievance. The crime committed against Princess Elia cannot go unavenged. If that is enough for Dorne to offer support, then perhaps we can reshape the realm together." Doran steepled his fingers. His face remained impassive, but his eyes glinted with an inner fire. Vengeance, justice. We Dornish have long memories. It was Gregor Clegane who harmed Elia, but under Tywin Lannister's command. If you seek the throne, you will find Tywin Lannister's swords arrayed against you. He is cunning and ruthless. Do you truly believe you can defeat him? Arthur's jaw set. If the realm rallies to a higher ideal, Tywin's gold may prove less persuasive. I know it is a risk, but I am prepared to die for this cause. Silence stretched. Then Doran nodded slowly. Dorne cannot openly declare for you yet, lest we provoke Robert's wrath prematurely. But there are many in Dorne who revere your name. I will not stop them if they wish to follow you. If you should grow strong enough to threaten the Iron Throne, I may lend my banners. Until then, I watch and wait. It was not the wholehearted declaration of support Arthur had hoped for, but it was better than outright refusal. He left Sunspear with a modest retinue of Dornish knights, fired by the memory of Elia Martell and enthralled by the sword of the morning. Over the next months, more and more gathered under Arthur's banner, forming a nascent army encamped near the banks of the Greenblood. They trained rigorously, forging themselves into a disciplined force driven by a single purpose, to uplift a Night King who promised honor above all. But King Robert's spies were everywhere. Word soon reached King's Landing that Arthur Dayne, once the Sword of the Morning, lived and was raising a rebellion in Dorne. Robert Baratheon was enraged. He still had some fondness for the memory of Ned Stark's old travails, but he saw this as a direct threat to his reign. Tywin Lannister likewise was alarmed. Arthur Dayne's name carried tremendous prestige. If too many lords rallied to him, it could spark a widespread uprising. A royal proclamation was issued. Arthur Dayne was a traitor, a sworn man of the disgraced Targaryen dynasty, and any lord who supported him would be deemed in rebellion against the crown. Robert threatened that the king's justice would be swift and merciless. But ironically, that decree fanned the flames of discontent even further. Those who hated King's Landing and Lannister influence now had a rallying cry for the Sword of the Morning. So began the War of the Rising Dawn, or so some bards called it. Arthur sought to avoid bloodshed where he could. His letters to lords across the realm spoke of a new era, of a kingdom ruled by an oath-bound knight who placed justice over greed. Lord after lord weighed their options. Some who had little love for Robert or the Lannisters quietly sent supplies or men to Arthur's growing army. Others were too fearful of the crown's retribution to join openly. The reach was divided. Mace Tyrell was sworn to King Robert, but many of the lesser Tyrell bannermen remembered the Targaryens fondly and disliked Lannister dominance. The Stormlands largely remained loyal to Robert, but pockets of discontent simmered. The Riverlands were torn. The Westerlands stood firmly with the Lannisters. The Vale was uncertain, as Jon Arryn sought to maintain peace. Inevitably, open conflict erupted when King Robert dispatched a host under Lord Tywin's command to stamp out the Dayne rebellion in Dorne. That host clashed with Arthur's forces in the rocky passes leading into the Dornish marches. It was a brutal engagement, the first pitched battle. Many expected Tywin's famed discipline to triumph. But Arthur Dayne fought at the head of his knights with dawn blazing in the sun, inspiring his men to feats of valor. The narrow terrain favored Dorne's defenders, and though outnumbered, they repelled Tywin's army, sending it retreating north with heavy losses. Songs sprang up almost overnight. How Arthur Dayne, unstoppable in shining plate, single-handedly slew a dozen knights who charged him. How he fought not out of malice, but with a knight's mercy, offering quarter to any who surrendered. The battered survivors carried stories of the Sword of the Morning's prowess back to the Westerlands, sowing fear and awe in equal measure. Within weeks, several Dornish lords who had hesitated now flocked to Arthur's banner. The old wounds from Elia Martell's death, from the murder of her children, fueled a collective desire to see the Lannisters humbled. Arthur accepted their fealty, but he stressed that this was not a simple war of vengeance. It was a war to restore knightly virtue to the throne. Many nodded and proclaimed they believed in that cause. Others privately muttered that revenge on the Lannisters was reason enough. As the conflict escalated, Arthur faced the grim reality that he was indeed plunging the realm into a new war. He took pains to keep civilians unharmed and forbid the sacking of any village or holdfast. He wanted to show that a Night King's war would not stoop to the cruelty so common in such conflicts. Many of his followers, especially the Dornish, adhered to this ideal at least outwardly. Yet war was war, and innocence inevitably suffered. Arthur took that guilt upon himself, vowing to end the bloodshed as soon as possible. King Robert himself marched south, brimming with fury, determined to crush this false king and drag Arthur's head through the streets of King's Landing. With him came lords from the Crownlands and the Stormlands, as well as some from the Reach who remained loyal. Ser Jaime Lannister, who once idolized Arthur Dayne, was said to lead the vanguard, wearing the white cloak of the Kingsguard. The irony was thick. One Kingsguard legend pitted against another. The next major engagement took place near the Prince's Pass. The day was scorchingly hot, the sun blazing high. Arthur commanded a position atop a rocky ridge, his banners flying. A rising sun behind a single sword. Opposite him, King Robert's forces stretched across the dusty plain. The king himself rode before the lines, massive warhammer in hand, cursing and shouting about traitors. Arthur watched him through the slit of his helm, heart heavy. He had once respected Robert for his martial prowess, but now saw him as a drunken, blustering occupant of a seat he did not deserve. A hush fell as Arthur spurred his horse forward, alone to parley. King Robert met him halfway, accompanied by Ser Jaime and a few other Kingsguard. Arthur recognized Ser Barristan Selmy among them, a great knight he had once fought alongside. Barristan's face looked pained to see Arthur alive and branded a traitor. Robert glowered, sweat trickling down his brow. He wore a heavy breastplate with the crowned stag sigil. "You have some damned nerve, Dayne," he spat. "I should have put a bounty on your head the moment I heard you breathed. Call off this foolishness, bend the knee, and I might grant you mercy." Arthur removed his helm, letting his silver-gray hair catch the sun. His voice was calm. "Your Grace, I have no desire to shed blood, but I cannot bend the knee to a king who neglects the realm, who allows corruption to fester. I claim the throne in the name of honor and chivalry." Robert snorted. "Honor and chivalry? You're a relic from the Targaryen madness. Rhaegar's dog. You talk of justice? Did you care for justice when you served the Mad King?" Arthur's expression tightened. "I served Rhaegar, not Aerys. If you must brand me a traitor, so be it. But the realm deserves better than it has received these past years." Robert's nostrils flared. "I'll show you what the realm deserves." He hefted his warhammer. "Last chance, Dayne. Surrender or die." Arthur bowed his head briefly. "I cannot surrender my oath to a just realm. So be it." They parted, each returning to their lines. The horns sounded, and the armies advanced. Arthur's knights clashed with the Crownland footmen in a swirl of dust and steel. War cries rang out across the pass. Robert himself plunged into the fray, swinging his hammer with terrifying strength, roaring like a wounded bull. Arthur, shining in pale armor, carved a path with dawn, his men rallying to the sight of the sword of the morning. The ground grew slick with blood, the sun beating down relentlessly. Ser Jaime Lannister sought out Arthur in the chaos, the Kingslayer versus the famed Sword of the Morning. Their duel was a spectacle of lethal grace, golden sword dancing against dawn's pale edge. Jaime fought with cunning skill, parrying Arthur's strikes with precision. Yet Arthur was the superior swordsman, and before long, he battered aside Jaime's defenses. In a climactic exchange, Arthur disarmed Jaime with a thrust that ripped the sword from his grip. Jaime stumbled back, eyes wide, expecting death. Arthur paused, breathing hard. He saw the confusion in Jaime's face, the fleeting admiration. Then Arthur stepped back. "Yield," Arthur said, voice echoing across the battlefield. Jaime's gaze flicked to Robert, who was locked in battle against a knot of Dornish spearmen. "I yield," he managed. Arthur's men took Jaime captive. Word spread that the Kingslayer had yielded to Arthur Dayne, the unstoppable blade. King Robert, seeing his vanguard in disarray, rallied his personal guard for a final charge. He crashed into the Dornish lines, scattering men like wheat. Arthur spurred his horse forward to meet the king in single combat. Their eyes locked across the swirling dust. Robert's hammer dripped with blood. Arthur's armor bore fresh dents and scratches, but dawn gleamed still. The king roared, spurring his massive destrier. Arthur braced, sword at the ready. When Robert's hammer came crashing down, Arthur twisted aside and slashed at the horse's flank. Not to kill, but to spook the beast. The horse reared, nearly toppling Robert. The king let out a furious bellow, regaining his seat with surprising agility. Arthur pressed his advantage, delivering swift strikes that forced Robert to keep his hammer in constant motion to block. Sparks flew. Robert let out a savage oath, then swung a blow that could have shattered any ordinary blade. Arthur deflected with dawn, which rang like a bell but did not break. He felt the force reverberate up his arms, nearly numbing them. Locked in mortal struggle, Arthur realized Robert was the stronger man physically, but his anger made him reckless. A calmer mind and supreme skill could prevail. Arthur feinted high, then swiped at the horse's rear, causing the destrier to lurch. Off balance, Robert nearly fell. Arthur slid aside, placing Dawn's tip at Robert's throat in a single fluid motion. The battlefield seemed to hold its breath. "Yield," Arthur commanded, voice carrying across the field. "Yield, and I will show you mercy." Robert's chest heaved. His face was bright red, sweat pouring down. He glared at Arthur with hatred. Then, to Arthur's astonishment, the king wrenched his hammer around for another strike, ignoring the blade at his throat. Arthur had no choice but to fling himself away, narrowly avoiding Robert's unstoppable blow. The tip of Dawn nicked Robert's collarbone, sending a spray of blood into the air. The king roared in pain, hammer smashing into empty air as Arthur spun aside. Any lesser knight would have tried to finish Robert in that moment. But Arthur's heart wavered. Could he truly slay King Robert, the man Ned Stark called friend, the realm's rightful victor of the rebellion? Doubt flickered in him, and Robert took advantage, charging again. Arthur parried desperately, feeling the toll of the long fight. Their horses circled, the clangor of steel mingling with the cries of dying men. In a final desperate exchange, Robert feinted left, then brought his hammer around with shocking speed. Arthur tried to block, but the blow caught him on the shoulder, smashing his pauldron and driving him from the saddle. He hit the ground, dazed, feeling the crunch of bone. Robert loomed over him, panting heavily, raising the hammer. Arthur's world narrowed. He was about to die, and with him the dream of a night king. Suddenly, a chorus of horns sounded from the ridge. Arthur, half-stunned, glimpsed fresh banners pouring into the pass. The golden spear and son of House Martell, the falling star of House Dayne, even a scattering of other Dornish sigils. Reinforcements had arrived, led by Prince Doran's brother, Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper himself. They crashed into Robert's flank, their arrival tipping the balance. Robert hesitated, momentarily caught between finishing Arthur and facing this new threat. That brief pause saved Arthur's life. One of Arthur's knights charged in, spooking Robert's horse. The king let out a curse and withdrew, calling to his men to regroup. The tide shifted swiftly. Robert, bleeding from his collarbone, had no choice but to retreat, ceding the field to Arthur's forces. Arthur struggled to his feet, dizzy with pain. Allies helped him mount a spare horse. Oberyn Martell found him amid the chaos, clasping his uninjured shoulder. "You live, old friend. Well fought." The king flees. Arthur nodded wearily, the throbbing in his shoulder making speech difficult. It was an ugly, brutal victory, but it was victory nonetheless. The war waged on for many more months. Skirmishes raged across the Stormlands and the Reach, but Arthur's cause grew stronger after each engagement. Dorne's full muster came forth, at last swayed by Oberyn's fervor and the memory of Elia. Some of the Reach lords, disenchanted with King Robert, declared for Arthur. The Crownlands remained firm behind the king, but each day, More news came of lords questioning Robert's competence, especially as he grew more wrathful and less prudent. Tywin Lannister, nursing the blow to his pride from the earlier defeat, tried to lure renegade lords with gold. Some accepted, but the momentum continued in Arthur's favor. The stage was set for a final confrontation near Summerhall's ruins, a symbolic place fraught with Targaryen history. Robert marched with a battered host, fewer than he had started with, yet still formidable. Arthur commanded a swelling force, infused with a zeal for their Night King. The realm held its breath. Days before the battle, a parley was arranged at the old castle's shattered gates. Arthur, his arms still in a sling, but wearing his battered plate, approached on foot. Opposite stood Robert, looking weary, his face older and etched with lines of frustration. With him was Ser Barristan, solemn and grim. Arthur noticed that Ser Jaime was nowhere to be seen, presumably still a captive or ransomed away. Robert stared at Arthur with undisguised loathing. "I underestimated you," the king muttered, "but I'll not repeat that mistake." Arthur inclined his head. "Nor did I wish this war, yet here we are." Robert snorted. "Are you here to demand my crown? Or to beg a truce?" Arthur drew a slow breath. "I am here to offer peace, if you will lay down your crown. Let the realm decide its king by the sword if you refuse, but think of the thousands who will die in another pitched battle. Surrender, Robert. I will spare you, as a sworn knight must do." Barristan's eyes flicked to Robert. The king's lips twisted in a bitter smile. "You think I'd yield to you, Dayne? Gods, you're more deluded than I thought. If you wanted to avoid bloodshed, you should have stayed dead." Arthur studied Robert for a long moment. He saw more than just anger. He saw wounded pride, betrayal, regrets, and perhaps even fear. But the lines had been drawn too deeply. Arthur simply bowed his head, sorrow heavy in his chest. "Then tomorrow we settle this." Robert spat on the ground. "I'll see you in the field, traitor." With that, the king turned, striding away. When dawn broke, the battle lines formed around Summerhall's charred remains. Arthur's forces, buoyed by months of victories, advanced methodically. Robert's men, fewer but fiercely loyal, roared defiance. The clash was like thunder, banners snapping in the morning wind. From the ramparts of the ruined castle, watchers beheld a spectacle of courage and carnage. Arthur took the field despite his injured shoulder, riding near Oberyn Martell and a few of his best knights. He refused to shy away. If he expected the realm to follow him for his code of honor, he must lead from the front. Dawn glowed in his hand, though each strike sent shocks of pain through his arm. His men rallied at the sight of him, chanting, "Dawn! Dawn! Dawn!" King Robert thundered into the fray once more, unstoppable in his wrath. Yet the battle soon turned against him. A fierce charge by the Dornish cavalry shattered the Baratheon left flank. The battered crown forces tried to regroup, but the presence of House Dayne's staunch knights and the fiery passion of House Martell overwhelmed them. Robert's captains urged him to withdraw, to regroup later, but the king refused. He would not retreat again. He bellowed curses at his fleeing bannermen, charging headlong at the center of Arthur's line. Finally, Arthur and Robert met again, two battered knights, each determined to finish what they had begun. Robert's warhammer rose and fell like the wrath of the gods, each blow a potential end to Arthur's life. Arthur danced away, trying to ignore the searing agony in his shoulder, relying on technique over brute strength. Step by step, the swirling melee around them fell away, forming a circle of watchers. The fighting seemed to slow as men sensed this duel would decide the day. Robert fainted, hammered at Arthur's wounded side. Arthur's reflexes saved him, parrying and riposting. Each clash of hammer and sword produced deafening clangs. Robert's raw power was monstrous, but Arthur's skill remained unmatched. He saw openings, struck with precision. A cut along Robert's thigh, another that bashed against the king's breastplate. Robert gasped, nearly losing his grip. Yet the king refused to fall. With a roar of defiance, he swung wide, catching Arthur off guard. The The hammer slammed into Arthur's injured shoulder, splintering the pauldron, sending bone-deep pain roaring through him. Arthur staggered, nearly dropping Dayne. Robert seized the moment for a killing blow. Arthur, half-blind with agony, rolled aside, narrowly avoiding the hammer's impact. Blow by blow, the duel wore them both down. Arthur's muscles trembled, sweat stinging his eyes, blood trickling from beneath his armor. Robert's breathing was ragged, his injuries sapping his might. Finally, in a last desperate exchange, Arthur managed to slip Dayne's edge past Robert's guard. The pale blade bit into the king's side, piercing armor. Robert let out a raw scream, dropping to one knee. He tried to heft his hammer again, but Arthur kicked it away, then placed Dayne's tip at Robert's throat, just as he had in the Prince's Pass. "Yield," Arthur rasped, voice shaking with exertion. "For the sake of the realm, yield." Blood foamed at Robert's lips. He glared up, defiant, but the strength drained from him. Slowly, he sank to the blood-soaked ground, letting out a bitter laugh. "You damned fool. I should have killed you at the tower." Then the life faded from his eyes, and Robert Baratheon died at the foot of Summerhall's ruins, the site where Targaryen dreams once burned. Silence rippled across the battlefield. The king was dead, the morale of the crown's forces shattered. Many threw down their arms. Others fled. Arthur Dayne, barely standing, was lifted from his horse and borne away by his men. Cheers rose, mingled with the groans of the wounded. Dawn glimmered in the new day's light, a symbol of rebirth, or so the bards would claim. In the aftermath, Arthur's supporters declared him the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms, the Night King of the Rising Dawn. Messengers galloped to every corner of the realm with news of Robert Baratheon's death and Arthur Dayne's victory. The war was not yet wholly over. Stannis Baratheon held Storm's End and might yet contest the throne. Tywin Lannister refused to bow, and pockets of resistance remained. But the heart of the crown's power was shattered. The small folk, weary of war, saw a new champion in Arthur, a man of legend who had triumphed against staggering odds. In King's Landing, chaos reigned. Cersei Lannister, Robert's queen, raged and schemed to preserve power for her son, Joffrey, or so she claimed. Yet, with the king dead, many of the capital's lords and merchants began to wonder if the Lannisters could truly hold the city against the unstoppable sword of the morning. Tywin Lannister gathered an army in the Westerlands, but his previous defeats and the realm's discontent made it a daunting task to challenge a victorious Arthur Dayne, especially if other great houses rallied behind him. Arthur himself, recovering from his wounds, felt only a hollow ache at the thought of wearing the crown. He never truly desired it for personal glory. But now he had no choice but to fulfill the promise he made. He would take the throne or die trying to end the cycle of corruption and war. He established a new seat of power in Summerhall's ruins temporarily, vowing to rebuild it as a symbol of a new dawn for the realm. Dorne officially proclaimed him king, as did many lords in the Reach who saw no advantage in continuing the war. Even some river lords sent envoys to treat with him. The North under Eddard Stark remained watchful, not openly declaring for or against. Arthur understood. Ned Stark was an honorable man but loyal to Robert's memory. Yet with Robert gone, perhaps Ned would at least acquiesce to a new peaceful order, if Arthur offered pardons and fair treatment. Days stretched into weeks. Bit by bit, more lords sent their fealty. Some cynically believed that Arthur's star would rise as unstoppable as the dawn. Others were swayed by the songs of a chivalrous knight stepping forth to claim the realm from chaos. Barristan Selmy came of his own accord, battered by the war, to offer his sword. The king's guard was sworn to protect a just king. "I see no juster man than you," Barristan said, kneeling with tears in his eyes. Arthur raised him gently and made him the first member of his renewed Kingsguard, aiming to restore that order to its former glory. The High Septon, at first uncertain, found his following clamoring for an anointed knight to become king. Arthur traveled in secret to Oldtown, where he spoke with the High Septon, appealing to the faith's ideals. He promised to uphold the faith, to honor the Seven with the virtues of knighthood. Though the faith rarely crowned kings themselves, The High Septon gave his blessing for a coronation, seeing the public fervor. So it was that Arthur Dayne made his slow, cautious approach to King's Landing. By then, the city was in uproar. Many had fled to avoid the chaos of war. The Lannisters remained entrenched, but their forces were outnumbered. Tywin had marched west to protect Casterly Rock from raiding Dornishmen and had left the capital to the questionable leadership of Cersei and the Gold Cloaks. Tension mounted outside the walls as Arthur's forces encamped. He did not wish to storm King's Landing and subject it to sacking. Instead, he arranged negotiations with the city's leaders. Inside the Red Keep, Cersei tried to rally the court. But with Robert dead and no guarantee of reinforcements from Tywin soon enough, support for House Lannister was dwindling. Varys, the master of whisperers, measured the winds of power and found them blowing toward Arthur. Peter Baelish, cunning as ever, saw an opportunity for advancement and likely worked behind the scenes to broker deals. In a shock to many, the Gold Cloaks eventually opened the gates to Arthur's knights, concluding that fighting to the death for a lost cause was foolish. Arthur rode into King's Landing in battered armor, Dawn sheathed at his side, flanked by Barristan Selmy and a column of knights carrying the banner of the rising sun behind a single sword. The small folk lined the streets, curious, hungry, uncertain. Yet many cheered, for a legendary hero had come to claim the throne. They had no love left for the Lannisters, who had done little but tax them and close their doors in times of need. In the Red Keep, Arthur faced Cersei Lannister, who stood trembling, her children huddled at her side. She demanded to know his terms. Arthur studied Joffrey's sullen, wary face, Tommen's frightened gaze, Myrcella's tears. He felt no pleasure in their fear. They were children trapped in the storm. "I have no desire to harm you or your children," Arthur said at last. "You are free to depart for Casterly Rock, if you wish, or remain here in peace, provided you swear no treachery against the new realm. Your father may choose to negotiate terms of surrender. The choice is yours." Cersei's lips pressed thin. She despised the idea of kneeling to a Dornish knight. But without armies to support her, she had no recourse. She blinked back tears of rage, then inclined her head. "Very well," she said through gritted teeth. "I will depart with my children." Arthur's men allowed her to leave the Red Keep peacefully. The handful of Lannister men-at-arms who remained scurried to follow her, heading west toward uncertain prospects with Tywin. Arthur took no vengeance. He declared amnesty for those who had served under Robert or the Lannisters, so long as they pledged loyalty to the new order. Some cynics mocked him for weakness, but Arthur believed it was the only path to end the bloodshed. He had warred to bring peace, not to slaughter his opponents. Within days, the city bent the knee. Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, was led into the great throne room where the Iron Throne loomed, fashioned from 1,000 melted swords. A hush fell among the gathered crowd. Lords, knights, priests, and small folk. With measured steps, Arthur approached the throne he had never truly wished to claim, but was now bound to by oath and necessity. He stood before it, gazing upon the twisted steel. So much blood had been shed for this seat of power. So many kings had faltered. Could he do better? Barristan Selmy waited at his side, and the High Septon stood with holy oils. "Will you swear to uphold justice and mercy, to rule for the good of all, to embody the virtues of knighthood?" The High Septon asked in a resonant voice. Arthur bowed his head. "I swear it. By the Seven, I shall be a Night King, placing the realm's well-being above my own." With solemn gravity, the High Septon anointed him. Barristan unsheathed Dawn, handing it ceremonially to Arthur. "May the Sword of the Morning guide the realm into a new dawn," Barristan intoned, his voice echoing in the vast hall. Arthur rested a hand on the Iron Throne's arm, feeling the chill of metal beneath his palm. He did not seat himself yet. Instead, he turned to face the assembly. "I stand before you not as a conqueror, but as a knight who believes in our shared ideals. For too long, the realm has suffered under kings who took more than they gave. We must forge a new path of compassion, justice, and honor. I ask for your help, lords, knights, and small folk alike, to mend what was broken and to end the cycle of war that has claimed so many lives. A hush, and then a rising applause from many in the crowd. Some were uncertain, some still fearful, but a seed of hope stirred in their hearts. Perhaps, just perhaps, this new king, this legendary knight, might do better than those who came before. At last, Arthur turned, setting Dayne aside. With careful deliberation, he took his seat upon the Iron Throne. A hush fell once more. The Sword of the Morning had become the king of the 7 kingdoms, or those that would accept his reign. The metal pressed cold against his back, and he felt the prick of a sharp blade along the throne's edge, a reminder that the seat was never meant to be comfortable. With that prick came blood, a single bead running down his neck. The throne, it was said, cut unworthy kings. A sign, some claimed, that the realm itself judged its ruler. Arthur inhaled, ignoring the sting. He stared out at the hall, scanning faces. He saw fear, worship, suspicion, awe. Barristan knelt before him. Then others followed. A wave of bending knees spread through the throne room. A new king had risen, a king whose entire life had been shaped by the vow of a knight. Was he worthy? Would he bring lasting peace and justice? Or was this just another turn in the wheel of power, soon to break under the realm's endless intrigues? Only time would tell. But for now, the realm witnessed an unlikely coronation, and the songs would speak of it for generations to come. In the north, Ned Stark heard the news with a heavy heart. Robert was dead. A new king sat the throne. Ned kept his counsel. He had not yet bent the knee, nor had he declared war. Arthur Dayne had promised to keep Jon's secret. Perhaps, if the new king was truly honorable, Jon could someday learn who he was, free of fear. Perhaps it would be safer now. Or perhaps new perils lurked. Ned prayed to the old gods for guidance, uncertain if he should rally his men for or against this Night King. Across the sea, Viserys and Daenerys Targaryen heard rumors of a new usurper, a king who was once Kingsguard to their father's line. Viserys fumed, outraged that a Dornish knight dared to claim the Iron Throne that was rightfully his. Yet whispers told of Arthur Dayne's vow to restore honor, to protect the Targaryen legacy as best he could. Daenerys, still young, listened quietly, wondering if she might find an ally in the new king, or if she must someday cross the sea with fire and blood to reclaim her birthright. In the Westerlands, Tywin Lannister seethed behind the walls of Casterly Rock, brooding on how best to restore his family's honor and influence. He would not forget the humiliation he had suffered. He bided his time, forging alliances in the shadows, preparing for the moment when the new king might falter. But for now, the 7 kingdoms had a new ruler, Arthur Dayne, the Night King. He set about forming a small council of men and women known for integrity, Barristan Selmy, a few wise lords from the Reach, and a maester or two from the Citadel who believed in knowledge over intrigue. He tried to quell corruption, to reform the tax system, to address the debts that weighed on the realm. He personally traveled through the streets of King's Landing, seeing the squalor of Flea Bottom, the orphans and beggars, distributing alms and demanding that the city watch maintain order without cruelty. Some aristocrats balked at this show of humility. Kings, they said, should remain aloof. But Arthur insisted that a true knight must know his people's suffering. On certain nights, Arthur climbed to the highest balcony of the Red Keep, gazing across the dark city to the horizon. Dawn hung at his side, a reminder of who he was. He thought of Rhaegar, of Elia, of Ned Stark and the child hidden in the north, of all the shattered vows and broken dreams that had led him here. Sometimes he wondered if the realm would have been better off had he died at the Tower of Joy, letting Robert's rule go unchallenged. But then he remembered the cruelty, the corruption, the endless plight of the small folk. He had made a choice, one born of duty to the realm. He had claimed the Iron Throne with the conviction that only a knight's unwavering vows, only the heart of a man who truly believed in honor, could steer the 7 kingdoms toward a just future. He did not know if he would succeed. He might fail like so many kings before him. But as dawn broke each morning, illuminating the spires of King's Landing, Arthur Dayne rose from his bed determined to prove that an anointed knight, bound by the highest ideals, could reign not as a tyrant or a weak puppet, but as a king of the morning, shining light into the darkest corners of the realm. And so, beneath the newly hung banners in the throne room, a shining white sword on a field of dawn's first light, King Arthur Dayne began his reign, hopeful that he could honor his vow, to be a knight first and a king second, and to guide the 7 kingdoms to a dawn free of the nightmares that had plagued it for far too long. Arthur Dayne rose from the Iron Throne that same evening with blood still drying on his collar. The prick from the throne's blade, a single bead of crimson tracing down his neck, seemed an ill omen to some, a sign that the seat accepted no ruler without exacting a price. Yet he refused to flinch in front of the courtiers and knights who watched him so closely. He stood before them, battered armor shedding flakes of dried mud and blood, and he addressed the throne room once more in a steady voice, underscoring that his reign would not be about pomp or cruelty, but about duty and knightly honor. The hush in the hall was deep. Behind Arthur stood Barristan Selmy, newly sworn to the reformed Kingsguard, a man who had once served Ares and then Robert, now bowing to Arthur's claim. Beside Barristan were a handful of Arthur's closest knights. Ser Luther Jourdain of the Tor, Ser Andre Dalt with the sign of the lemon tree on his surcoat, and the fierce Lady Nemella Toland, who had taken up arms in the final battles as bravely as any man. A sprinkling of lords and ladies watched them from the sidelines, those who had weathered the transition in King's Landing or had arrived too late to flee with Cersei. The rest of the court, made up of lesser functionaries, scribes, and minor officials, shifted anxiously, trying to gauge how this new king would treat them. That evening, Arthur ordered that the feasting halls be opened to the small folk. He sent men into Flea Bottom with carts of grain, dried meats, and casks of small beer. Whispers spread that the new king would feed the hungry before he celebrated himself. Many small folk emerged from their hovels, peering timidly to see if the stories were true. They found the keep's gates open, with Arthur's own knights handing out bread and salted fish to the crowd. People jostled forward, pressing their children closer. Some looked at Arthur's banners with gratitude, some with fear, not knowing whether this generosity was genuine or a fleeting show. But for the moment they ate well, and they did not see soldiers beating them back with clubs. That alone was enough for hope to stir. Later that night, Arthur met in private with a hastily gathered assembly of counselors. Grand Maester Pycelle was nowhere to be found. He had fled at the first rumors of the city's gates being opened to Arthur's forces, or so the servants claimed. In his stead came Maester Cordell, a timid but capable man from the Citadel who had once served as assistant to Pycelle. Also present were several minor Crownlands lords who had survived the war by staying neutral or by cautiously defecting in the final hours. Barristan Selmy stood guard near the chamber's door, solemn and watchful. The makeshift council convened around a long table of dark wood. Arthur, still wearing his dented breastplate, he had not yet found time to remove it, sat at the head, hands splayed on the table's surface. He surveyed them quietly. At length, he spoke in a voice that carried only the barest tremor of weariness. "We have claimed King's Landing, but not the entire realm," he said. "There are lords who remain loyal to the memory of King Robert, or perhaps to the boy Joffrey, if they think he has any claim. And of course, Tywin Lannister holds the Westerlands and much of its power. We must address this carefully. I do not desire more slaughter." A short, thin man with a patchy beard cleared his throat. "Your Grace, the Lannisters will not yield so easily. Their hatred will run deep. They will say you are no rightful king, just a traitor who slew Robert. And the gold of Casterly Rock buys many swords." Arthur nodded. "Yes, the Lannisters must be convinced this war cannot be won by them. If Lord Tywin insists on continued bloodshed, we will face him on the field. But perhaps he can be made to see reason. Pride, however, is a powerful foe." Barristan stepped forward, arms crossed over his white cloak. "Lord Tywin was shamed in Dorne. Your forces bested him at the passes, and he lost men and prestige. He'll wish to avenge that. Yet he may be cunning enough to wait, to starve the city of supplies, or to isolate you by forging alliances. We should strike first or secure alliances of our own." Arthur ran a hand through his silver-gray hair, still streaked with dust from the road. "We have alliances in part. Dorne is ours. Much of the Reach has declared for me, though I must treat with Mace Tyrell formally. Some of the river lords have bent the knee. The Vale remains aloof as far as we know, but we must unify quickly. My men are weary, and winter is on the horizon. The realm cannot abide a protracted struggle. A hush followed. Then Maester Cordell ventured, "Your Grace, might we consider the Iron Islands? They seldom bend willingly, but if they sense the realm is in flux, they may raid the coasts again. Balon Greyjoy tried to rise against King Robert not long ago. He was beaten, but the Ironborn always look for weakness." Arthur pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling the weight of every corner of the 7 kingdoms pressing in at once. "A problem for tomorrow," he said, "and even that might be too soon." "Thank you, Maester." They discussed other matters of urgent governance, replenishing the city's food stores, collecting coin to pay the soldiers who had marched with Arthur, restoring order in the streets, ensuring the crown's debts did not spiral further. Arthur had no illusions that wearing a crown would be easier than waging war. By the time the meeting ended, dawn was near, and he staggered to the king's apartments in the Red Keep, a suite that still bore the lion sigils and the reek of stale wine from Robert's time. He refused to sleep in the bed Robert had used. Instead, he requested a clean chamber, a fresh pallet, and water to wash. A pair of young servants hurried to prepare the rooms, wide-eyed at the prospect of serving the new king. Arthur dismissed all but Barristan, who lingered a moment to see that his liege was safely alone. The old knight bowed. "Your Grace, rest if you can. We have more to do in the morning. The city is uneasy." Arthur sank onto a wooden bench, staring at the gray light seeping through the window shutters. "I wonder, old friend," he murmured, "if Rhaegar had won, would it have been like this for him? The weight of it all, the constant worry about men's loyalties." Barristan's gaze was gentle. "Prince Rhaegar was a thoughtful man, and you know he bore many burdens. But he had his eyes fixed on prophecy, on destiny. Your Grace, you have your vow to the realm, your sense of honor. That is as strong a guide as any prophecy." Arthur nodded, exhaustion lining his face. "Thank you. Now go, get some rest. You have served me faithfully. I'll need your counsel again soon enough." Barristan gave a final bow and left. Arthur washed his face and shoulders in a basin of cool water, wincing at the bruises from the final clash with Robert. His shoulder ached fiercely, the old wound there only partially healed. If not for Oberyn Martell's intervention that day in the Prince's Pass, Arthur knew, he might well have died under Robert's hammer. Instead, Robert had died beneath Dawn's Point, despite Arthur's repeated offers of mercy. The memory cut deeper than any blade. But the new king had little choice now. Fate had set him on this path, and there was no turning back. He drifted into a fitful sleep. Within a fortnight, a semblance of stability took root in King's Landing. Arthur toured the city's walls, accompanied by his knights. The gold cloaks had largely surrendered, but he replaced their most corrupt officers with men of proven integrity. Some in the Watch resented this, but others expressed relief. Robert's neglect had allowed petty tyrants to thrive. Now they had a king who walked among them, stopping to speak with officers and small folk alike. On one such walk, an old baker thrust a loaf of rye into Arthur's hands. He tried to refuse payment, but the man insisted, tears in his eyes. "You feed us, we feed you, Lord King," the baker said. "Never seen a king do for us what you done, giving out bread and not demanding coin." Arthur thanked him, though it humbled him. He had done little so far, yet the people's hopes were desperate. He must not fail them, he told himself. In the Red Keep, he moved into a new routine of daily petitions. The hall opened so commoners and lords alike could present grievances. To ensure fairness, Barristan Selmy and Maester Cordell oversaw the queue, calling up men and women with disputes over stolen property, debts, broken contracts. Arthur listened patiently, sometimes passing judgment on the spot, other times consulting with the city's magistrates. 1,000 problems, large and small, drifted across the marble floor. At times, he longed for the simpler life of a wandering knight, but he suppressed that yearning. This was what it meant to be a king, to spend hours grappling with the realm's troubles, not to lounge in feasts and hunts, ignoring the cries of the people. As the weeks went by, envoys arrived from across the 7 kingdoms. Some came to bend the knee formally. Lords of the Crownlands, the Rosbys and Hayfords, the Masseys and Stokeworths, approached the throne in turn. They had supported Robert for years but saw no advantage in challenging the new king, especially with Tywin Lannister so far away. They swore fealty, though some with obvious reluctance. Arthur accepted them graciously, ignoring any hint of resentment they might hold. If the realm was to know peace, he had to allow reluctant hearts to kneel without demanding vengeance. Next came Lords of the Reach. Mace Tyrell himself did not appear. He had sent his son, Loras Tyrell, as an envoy. Loras was young, barely a man grown, but renowned as a skilled tourney knight. He carried a letter from his father, a carefully worded missive that recognized Arthur's claim for the good of the realm, so long as House Tyrell's privileges and lands in the Reach were affirmed. Arthur's mouth twitched at Mace Tyrell's transparent ambition, but he understood alliances came with a price. He publicly welcomed House Tyrell's support, praising their loyalty and naming Loras a champion of the new reign, which pleased the young knight. The Tyrell banners were large and wealthy, and Arthur needed them to ward off the threat from the west. The north remained quiet. No envoys came from Winterfell. The gossip in court was that Eddard Stark was in mourning for his friend Robert, or else waiting to see how the realm settled. Arthur understood Ned's caution. He only hoped the memory of the Tower of Joy and the promise Arthur had given, to keep Jon Snow's parentage secret, did not sour their relations. If Ned wished to stay neutral, Arthur would not force the point. The last thing the realm needed was more war. And Arthur privately vowed that if Ned Stark sent a raven with terms or demands, he would listen. He owed Ned a debt, in a way, for sparing Jon's life and letting Targaryen blood survive. But the more immediate concern was Tywin Lannister. Ravens flew in daily from outriders, from scouts, from uncertain bannermen in the Westerlands. Tywin had holed up in Casterly Rock, summoning his banners. Some lords in the Westerlands, like the Reynes and Tarbecks, had once been wiped out by Tywin's wrath. Others might see a chance to slip from the Lannisters' iron grip if the new king offered them better terms. Yet fear of Tywin's retribution ran strong, and he still commanded a large army, funded by the gold mines of the Rock. Now and then, Arthur received letters from Tywin's camp, each more insulting than the last. Kingslayer, traitor, upstart, they called him. Tywin made it clear that unless Arthur released Jaime Lannister, captured at the Prince's Pass, there would be no peace. Arthur never intended to keep Jaime in harsh captivity. In fact, he had treated him with knightly courtesy, allowing him comfortable quarters and freedom of movement within reason, provided he vowed not to flee. Jaime had complied outwardly at least. In the interim, Arthur tried to engage him in conversation, hoping to glean insight into Tywin's mind. But Jaime was cagey. He spat at the idea of Arthur's new reign, though his bitterness was tempered by a grudging respect for the man who had bested him. Arthur offered that Jaime might rejoin the Kingsguard if he swore new vows to the Night King, but Jaime only laughed in a hollow way. "Serve you," Jaime said one day in the Red Keep's yard, where Arthur had invited him to walk. "You think I want another white cloak after everything that happened with Aerys and Robert?" He glanced at Arthur's bandaged shoulder, the memory of their duel fresh in both minds. "You offered me mercy on the field, and for that, I'm not ungrateful. But I have no desire to play the loyal servant again. Not after the realm called me Kingslayer for doing what was necessary." Arthur studied Jaime's face, seeing a flicker of old pain. "I understand, but know this, my intention is not to hold you hostage indefinitely. If your father would only speak with me in good faith, we might arrange terms." Jaime's expression hardened. "My father doesn't know the meaning of good faith, especially not when he's wounded. He'll come at you, and if you think you can keep the city and quell the West, you'll soon see how cunning Tywin Lannister can be." Arthur did not doubt it. He sighed. "I suppose we shall see, but the door remains open, Sir Jaime. If you choose to stand for something beyond your father's pride, beyond the gold of Casterly Rock, you might find redemption in it. Jaime snorted, looking away. Redemption, another fancy word for fools, Dayne. My sister always said redemption is for the weak. Arthur let the comment hang. He knew there was more to Jaime Lannister's cynicism, but pressing further would yield nothing. So he let the conversation end, leaving Jaime to brood in the courtyard. Soon after, scouts confirmed that Tywin Lannister had begun to march in force, moving east. Balon Swan, now styled Ser Balon of the Kingsguard, Arthur had expanded the ranks to include honorable knights from among those who had proved themselves, brought the news directly to Arthur's Solar. Tywin's intent seemed to be to rally disaffected Crownlander lords and isolate King's Landing. Tactically, it made sense. The Lannister host was large, but perhaps not large enough to lay siege to the capital outright. Tywin might be testing the king's reaction. Arthur called an emergency council meeting. Present were Barristan Selmy, Oberyn Martell, who had remained in King's Landing as the Dornish ambassador and advisor, Lady Nemella Toland, and the Tyrell envoys. Arthur outlined the threat. Some advised a preemptive strike to catch Tywin on the march before he could fortify positions. Others cautioned that the realm was still recovering and any major new battle near the capital could plunge the city back into chaos. A siege would mean starving the people again. Arthur did not want that. In the end, he chose a measured approach. He would gather a host, but keep it near the capital while sending out smaller detachments under loyal lords to fortify the key roads from the west. If Tywin advanced rashly, Arthur's men could slow him, forcing him into a war of attrition he might not be able to afford. Meanwhile, envoys would continue trying to persuade Western lords to break from Tywin. If enough of them abandoned the Lion Banner, Tywin would find himself alone against a tide of opposition. It was a plan, but not a certain one. War seldom bows to neat strategies. Arthur prayed it might avert a bloody confrontation. He was loath to take to the battlefield again, especially so soon after the final confrontation with Robert. Though his body had mostly healed, the nightmares still came at times. A swirl of dust, Robert's hammer, the taste of blood in his mouth. He had never wanted to kill Robert. If only that day had ended differently, but that was the past. A king must look forward, not back. Meanwhile, across the narrow sea, the exiled Targaryens received tidings of Arthur's ascension. Some merchants in Pentos spoke of a Dornish Night King on the Iron Throne, a man once loyal to Rhaegar. The exiled Prince Viserys bristled at the news, calling Arthur a traitor who had stolen what was rightfully the Targaryen throne. Daenerys, younger and more reflective, wondered if Arthur might be an ally. Though Viserys raged that the Iron Throne belonged only to him, others in Essos whispered that if a man so close to the Targaryens now wore the crown, maybe there was a chance for some reconciliation. But Viserys refused to hear of it. He continued to style himself King Viserys, raving about his birthright, ignoring the fact that House Targaryen's forces were meager at best, reliant on the charity of Magister Illyrio and other benefactors. Arthur had heard scraps of intelligence about the Targaryen situation, carried by spies and traveling merchants. He had no personal enmity for the Targaryen children. Indeed, he had served Rhaegar faithfully, and part of him wanted to protect Daenerys at least, if not Viserys. But a direct invitation for them to return might spark panic among those who still feared Targaryen rule. Arthur was not blind to how that might unravel his carefully won alliances. Many lords had turned on Aerys for good reason, and fear of dragons lingered in memory. Perhaps one day, if Daenerys proved worthy, there could be a place for her at court. But for now, Arthur refrained from any overture. He had too many pressing troubles within the realm. Another rumor that reached him, whispered by a merchant from the Jade Sea, concerned a Sellsword company that included a young man claiming to be Prince Aegon Targaryen, Rhaegar's son, who many believed was slain in the sack of King's Landing. Arthur wrestled with the possibility. He had believed Ned Stark's word that the child Rhaegar fathered with Lyanna was the only living Targaryen male heir. But if the rumors from Essos held any truth, could Rhaegar's other son, Alya's child, have been smuggled out? Arthur could not confirm it. He only knew that once upon a time, the mountain had been said to have butchered the Targaryen children. If that was false, if the boy lived, it changed everything. But for now, he had no proof. 2 months into Arthur's reign, the small council, still forming an identity, urged the new king to hold a grand coronation ceremony, a spectacle to formally cement his legitimacy. The High Septon in Old Town had given him the anointing in a hurried ceremony at Summerhall, but that was overshadowed by the final battles. Now, with the capital under control, the faith called for a proper coronation at the Great September of Baelor, attended by lords from every corner of the realm. The notion of fanfare did not sit well with Arthur, but he recognized the political necessity. A display of unity and splendor might reassure the people that he was no mere warlord but truly their king under the Seven. Preparations began, and soon the city was abuzz with talk of the upcoming ceremony. Arthur decreed that no commoners would be barred from watching the procession. The gold cloaks were to maintain order, but to allow the small folk free access to the streets. He even arranged for baskets of fruit and bread to be distributed, an act that sparked as much gratitude as suspicion. Some insisted he was trying to buy the love of the crowd. Others whispered that no king had cared this much for the small folk since perhaps the days of good King Dayne or Aegon the Unlikely. Amid these preparations, a curious development took place in the dungeons. One of Tywin's last letters reached Arthur, offering a prisoner exchange, Jaime for certain highborn knights taken by Arthur's side. The letter's tone was imperious, but Tywin hinted that releasing Jaime might pave a road to truce. Arthur debated the offer with Barristan and Oberyn. Barristan was wary, Oberyn distrustful. But Arthur believed that keeping Jaime a prisoner indefinitely would only harden Tywin's resolve. Perhaps a gesture of good faith could open a door to peace. So he invited Jaime to the throne room again, this time with the letter in hand. Jaime read it, mouth twisting. "He wants me back," Jaime said sourly, though he won't admit it in so many words. "Doesn't want the house's prized heir rotting in a cell." He glanced at Arthur. "You're truly considering letting me go?" Arthur studied him. "I am, provided you give your sworn word to do no harm to me or my allies until this war is resolved, or if your father agrees to treat for peace. If you break your word, you doom your house's honor further." Jaime laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "Honor? The realm loves to spit that word whenever it suits. Very well. Let us say I give you my word not to attack you the moment I'm free. That does nothing to stop my father from marching. But you think he'll be moved by your gesture?" "I do not know," Arthur replied. "But the alternative is a war that claims thousands of lives. I'll give every chance for peace. Should your father spurn it, I'll do what I must." Jaime's gaze flicked to Dawn, which Arthur wore sheathed across his back. "He'll never kneel to you. He might negotiate." "Yes, but kneel." Jaime shook his head. "You'd best brace for a siege or a cunning trap." Despite the grim warning, Arthur resolved to proceed. He drafted a careful reply to Tywin. He would release Jaime in exchange for a pledge that Tywin meet with a royal envoy to discuss terms of peace. Tywin need not kneel, only attend negotiations under safe conduct. If Tywin refused, Jaime would still go free, but any hope of reconciliation would fade. Arthur's lords grumbled that he was being too soft, but the new king held firm. "Peace is worth the risk," he said. "If Tywin remains intractable, so be it. We'll fight, but I'll not close the door on a chance." Within days, the exchange was arranged. Jaime Lannister rode out of King's Landing under a white flag, escorted by a company of Arthur's knights, who were to bear him halfway across the Blackwater to an agreed-upon point. There, Lannister men took charge of him, and in return, several captive knights were released back to Arthur's side. The meeting was tense. No sign of Tywin himself, but the exchange went smoothly enough. Word spread that King Arthur Dayne had let the Kingslayer go free, a magnanimous gesture or a foolish gamble, depending on whom one asked. Once Jaime was safely delivered, Arthur waited, half expecting to receive a scornful reply or no reply at all. Yet a moon's turn later, a raven arrived from the Westerlands. Tywin Lannister agreed to send a party of envoys to meet the so-called king in King's Landing for a parley under truce. He himself might not attend, but his ambassadors would have full authority to speak on his behalf. It was a small breakthrough, though many of Arthur's closest advisors warned that any negotiation with Tywin would be riddled with deception. Still, the timing worked in Arthur's favor. The coronation day approached, and the city was filling with lords and knights from every region that recognized Arthur's rule, or at least sought to remain on cordial terms. Arthur invited Tywin's envoys to attend the coronation as well, to see with their own eyes that the new king was not a barbarian or a pretender. Whether they accepted remained uncertain. Amid all this, another visitor arrived in King's Landing, a man who stirred anxiety in Arthur's heart more than any Lannister. Eddard Stark rode through the city gates with a modest retinue of Northmen, his face grave beneath the sun's glare. Word reached Arthur within moments. Some courtiers fretted that Stark had come to challenge the new king in vengeance for Robert. Others said it must be parley, a final chance to keep the North from open war. Arthur quietly hoped it was the latter. He had sent no direct summons to Ned, not after their last conversation in Winterfell. But Ned's arrival, unannounced, likely meant the North had chosen a course. Arthur waited in the throne room, perched on the Iron Throne as calmly as he could manage. A hush blanketed the hall. Ned Stark entered in riding leathers, accompanied by several of his bannermen. Lord Manderly, tall and broad, Galbart Glover, quiet and keen-eyed, and a few loyal knights from smaller houses. The Northerners advanced across the marble floor with measured steps. Those in the gallery watched with bated breath, well aware of the storied history between these two men. Arthur stood, descending the steps slowly. "Lord Stark," he said, voice echoing, "you honor us with your presence." Ned's gray eyes flicked around the hall, noting the banners of House Dayne and House Martell among the tapestries. His mouth was set in a grim line. He stopped a few strides from Arthur, ignoring the hush of the onlookers. "Your Grace," Ned said, bowing stiffly at the waist, "I have come to speak on behalf of the North." Arthur inclined his head in return. He felt an undercurrent of relief at hearing Ned use the royal address. That was not open defiance, at least. "Speak, then. The realm is eager to hear the North's words." Ned's posture was tense. "I have no wish to dishonor the memory of my friend, King Robert. But the North has no appetite for a prolonged war. Your victory over Robert was decisive, and the crown rests on your head now. However, many in the North feel uncertain of what your rule will mean for us. We have bled in wars for the Iron Throne before, only to be neglected." Arthur nodded. "I understand. I cannot undo the losses of the past. But I can promise that I will not repeat Robert's neglect. The North shall have a just share of the realm's attention and resources. I intend to be a king for all the kingdoms, not just the southern lords." Ned measured him, weighing the sincerity in Arthur's gaze. He knew Arthur's reputation for honor was more than a rumor. At last, Ned spoke softly. "Very well. The North will bend the knee, provided certain conditions are met. We want assurance that no vengeance or retribution will be taken against those who fought for Robert in the rebellion. We also want the North's traditions respected. The lords under my banner expect minimal interference from southern courts in our local matters." Arthur listened intently. "I can grant those conditions. There will be no mass punishments for the past. My concern is to unify the realm, not to stoke old hatreds. As for local governance, I will respect the North's traditions and your authority as Warden of the North. That said, we must remain one realm. The laws of the crown must still be upheld." Ned nodded, relief flickering across his eyes. "We can accept that." He paused, letting out a slow breath. "There is one more matter." A hush spread through the onlookers. Arthur's pulse quickened. He feared Ned might speak of Jon Snow's parentage in front of everyone. But Ned simply said, "King Robert was set on the destruction of all Targaryens. Now, rumors abound that you might harbor a different stance. The North seeks clarity. Will you allow exiled Targaryens to return? Will you name them your heirs, or champion their claims?" Arthur hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I have no intention of hunting down children for the crimes of their father. nor do I intend to declare the Targaryen exiles my heirs. The realm's rightful heir is not a matter for me to decide alone. House Targaryen's name may yet endure in Essos, but I do not plan to open the gates and invite a Targaryen restoration. My cause was the cause of knighthood, not of vengeance or blind loyalty to a past dynasty. Ned inclined his head, satisfied enough with that answer. Very well. Then, with a quiet finality, he knelt. He placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. Behind him, his bannermen dropped to one knee, a ripple of motion across the marble floor. In the name of the North, I, Eddard Stark of Winterfell, do hereby swear fealty to Arthur Dayne, King of the Seven Kingdoms. The watchers inhaled. An uneasy tension left the air. Arthur stepped forward, resting a hand on Ned's shoulder. I accept your oath, Lord Stark. Rise, and let the realm see that we stand united in peace. Ned rose, a stiffness still about him, but also a hint of relief. If he resented the new king for Robert's death, he gave no sign now. Perhaps Ned understood that Robert had chosen his own path in that final duel. Whatever the case, the North's acceptance of Arthur's rule was a momentous step toward stabilizing the kingdom. Later that evening, Arthur hosted a small feast in Ned's honor, welcoming the Northern lords. It was a modest affair compared to the lavish banquets of past courts. Food was simple but plentiful, wine was served, and minstrels played soft tunes. Arthur chose to sit among the Northern lords rather than elevated above them, an unusual gesture for a king. He asked them about the conditions in the north, about the harvest, about the dreaded onset of winter. Some warmed to him, intrigued by a monarch who actually seemed to care. Others remained wary, clutching their cups of ale with suspicion. Still, the tension in the hall gradually eased. Before long, Ned and Arthur found themselves alone for a moment in a recess of the great hall, the torchlight dancing across the stone walls. Ned's face was somber, yet his voice was quiet, almost gentle. You have done what you said you would, Arthur Dayne. You dethroned Robert or forced him to fight you, and you emerged victorious. Is your mind truly at peace with that? Arthur's gaze dropped. He remembered Robert's final breath, the bitterness in those dying eyes. No, he admitted. It haunts me, but I could not stand aside and let the realm decay under his reign. I offered him mercy. He refused. I wish it had been different. Ned sighed. I remember the day you and I fought at the Tower of Joy. So much death, for so many secrets. Now here we are again, shaped by our vows. He studied Arthur's face. I will keep my oath so long as you keep yours, to protect the realm, to rule justly, and to keep Jon's name safe. Arthur placed a hand on Ned's forearm, a gesture of solidarity. I have not forgotten, nor will I. So long as I draw breath, no harm shall come to your boy from my actions. His secret is safe. Ned nodded once. Then the North stands with you. May the gods grant us peace. In the days that followed, more lords arrived for the coronation. The city's narrow streets teemed with color as banners of a dozen great houses snapped in the wind. The Red Keep bustled with activity. Tournament grounds were hastily erected outside the city walls. Arthur had been reluctant to hold a tourney so soon after the war, but lords insisted it was tradition for a new king's coronation. Ultimately, he consented to a modest affair, imposing a limit on extravagant spending. Wealthy lords grumbled, but many knights were eager for a chance to tilt lances and display their prowess before the new king of the morning. The mood in the city turned festive, though tension lingered like a drawn bowstring. A day before the ceremony, envoys from Tywin Lannister arrived. The party was small, led by Lord Kevin Lannister, Tywin's brother, and a handful of ranking knights. Their entrance into King's Landing was subdued, accompanied by polite courtesy from Arthur's men. Kevin Lannister looked weary but kept his composure, politely requesting an audience. Arthur agreed at once, bringing them to the council chamber. There, Kevin presented Tywin's stance. The Lannisters did not recognize Arthur as the rightful king, but they desired an end to bloodshed. They demanded certain concessions in exchange for recognizing the current state of affairs, such as the reaffirmation of Lannister rights to the Westerlands, no punitive measures or forced indemnities for the war, and a place of high honor for House Lannister at court. Arthur listened carefully, aware that Tywin likely wanted far more than Kevan admitted. The negotiations would be delicate. Skepticism abounded among Arthur's advisors. Oberyn Martell, in particular, glowered at the Lannisters, remembering Elaya's murder. Yet Arthur had hammered out a principle from the start: no endless cycle of vengeance. If they sought to unify the realm, they had to offer the Lannisters a respectable place. Kevan's proposals were not insulting on the surface, and indeed they might be workable. But Kevan also quietly reminded them that Tywin wanted Jaime's place in the Kingsguard voided, so that Jaime could inherit Casterly Rock in time. In other words, House Lannister would not remain bound by the old arrangement that forced Jaime to remain in white robes for life. Arthur found that request less objectionable than some might have. Jaime had already shown no enthusiasm for rejoining the Kingsguard. If freeing him would help secure peace, so be it. But is Tywin prepared to swear fealty to me? Arthur asked, meeting Kevan's gaze. Kevan's face reddened slightly. My brother's pride is great. He is not ready to kneel, your grace. But perhaps an oath of loyalty from me, on behalf of the Westerlands, would suffice. A hush fell. Arthur's advisors bristled at this half-measure. They wanted Tywin personally on his knees. Yet Arthur recognized that might be a step too far. I will consider your proposal, he said calmly. We have a coronation on the morrow. If your party wishes to attend, I welcome you. We can resume our negotiations after. Kevan inclined his head stiffly. Thank you, your grace. So it was that the day of the coronation arrived in King's Landing, with more pomp and commotion than Arthur would have liked. Merchants crowded the streets, selling sweetmeats, spiced wine, ribbons, wooden trinkets of swords shaped like dawn, even crude likenesses of King Arthur in half-rusted armor. Minstrels sang new ballads about the rising dawn or the Night King, though some continued to sing older tunes praising Robert's rebellion, weaving in lines about the new day. People pushed and shoved to claim vantage points along the route from the Red Keep to the Great September of Baelor. Arthur dressed simply for the occasion. A suit of white enameled plate, reminiscent of Kingsguard armor, but trimmed with a faint morning sun motif. He wore no crown as he mounted his horse, leading a stately procession. At his side rode Barristan Selmy, the Lord Commander of the new Kingsguard, clad in white cloak and shining plate. Behind them came a retinue of knights bearing Arthur's sigil, a single white sword on a field that shaded from black at the bottom to pale gold at the top, signifying the coming dawn. Next followed Lords of Dorne, including Oberyn Martell, and Lords of the Reach, the Riverlands, and the Crownlands. Ned Stark and his Northmen formed an austere contingent near the rear. Even the Lannister envoys joined, though they wore their crimson cloaks and looked somewhat aloof. Crowds parted to let them pass through the city's main thoroughfare. Arthur watched from atop his horse as small folk cheered or stared in silence. Some knelt, others waved scraps of cloth in the air. Children pointed, wide-eyed. Arthur's heart felt heavy and hopeful all at once. He had lived as a wandering sellsword, then a rebel champion, then a king in name only. Now, for the first time, the realm was seeing him crowned in the light of day, with thousands of eyes upon him. He could almost hear Rhaegar's voice in his mind. Honor is a double-edged sword. Tread carefully. When they reached the marble steps of the Great September, the High Septon awaited them, flanked by 7 crystal columns representing the 7. The heart of the ceremony was solemn. Arthur dismounted and walked inside, accompanied by a chosen few, while the mass of courtiers and small folk crowded the outer plaza. Incense hung heavy in the air, and the walls glimmered with mosaic depictions of the 7 in their aspects. Arthur knelt before the altar, head bowed, as the High Septon anointed his brow with the holy oils. Then, from a velvet cushion, Barristan Selmy lifted the new crown, a simple circlet of steel filigree set with a single pale gem, cut so that it shimmered like starlight. A fitting piece for the sword of the morning, though modest compared to many crowns before it. The High Septon raised his voice, echoing off the sept's arches. By the grace of the Seven, we crown you Arthur of House Dayne, King of the Undulls, the Royner, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, Protector of the Realm. May you reign with the virtues of the knightly code: honor, justice, mercy, valor, and humility. With that pronouncement, Barristan placed the crown upon Arthur's head. The new king looked up, meeting the eyes of the assembled lords. He saw some with tears, some with stoic expressions, others with grudging acceptance. Then a swell of music rose, choir voices chanting a hymn to the Seven. Slowly Arthur stood. The weight on his head was slight compared to the burdens of the realm, yet the symbolic heft made his knees feel weak. He breathed deep, then turned to face the audience, lifting dawn from its scabbard. The pale blade caught the sepulchral light. "I vow," he said, voice echoing, "to rule as a knight above all, guided by the Seven's virtues. Let all men know that if they seek justice, they shall find it from me. If they seek mercy, they shall find it. But if they bring cruelty and treachery, they shall find no quarter." A thunderous cheer burst from the courtyard outside. It was repeated and magnified as it traveled through the city. The great September's interior resonated with the cry. Tears glistened on some cheeks. Others wore stony faces of caution. But in that instant, a wave of hope swept through many hearts. A knight had been crowned king. Perhaps the realm could know a gentler rule than it had in years past. Arthur bowed to the high septon, then sheathed on. The ceremony ended, and the congregation filed out onto the steps. The crowd roared anew. Arthur raised his hand in acknowledgement. He glimpsed Ned Stark near the foot of the steps, speaking quietly with Lord Kevin Lannister. A strange sight that Oberyn Martell hovered nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the Lannister party. Already the seeds of future tension were visible. That evening, a grand feast took place in the Red Keep's throne room. Trestle tables groaned under roast boar, spiced honey cakes, mulled wine, fresh fish from the Blackwater, and fruits brought from Dorne. Jugglers and minstrels performed, though Arthur insisted that the entertainment remain tasteful, free of the cruel jests and humiliations that sometimes plagued royal courts. Lords and ladies mingled, forging alliances or glaring at old foes across the hall. Arthur circulated among them, greeting each faction, ensuring no one felt slighted. He glimpsed Kevin Lannister in quiet discussion with Oberyn Martell, with Barristan Selmy acting as a calm mediator. If those three could talk without swords drawn, there was some hope for the realm after all. At one point, Arthur found himself face to face with Lady Sansa Tarly, sister to the newly named Lord Randall Tarly. She curtsied deeply, praising him for his wisdom. As she prattled about the glories of House Tarly, Arthur had to remind himself that he must listen patiently. Every noble felt they deserved a place in the king's ear. Another time, a half-drunk lord from Crackclaw Point stumbled up to him, babbling about border disputes with Rosby. Arthur guided the man to Maester Cordell for a thorough hearing in the morning. One by one, petty concerns, flattery, and genuine admiration swirled around him. Such was kingship. After many hours, he managed to escape to a side corridor, seeking fresh air by a narrow window. He leaned against the stone embrasure, exhaling as the cool night breeze touched his face. The flicker of torchlight from the yard below cast dancing shadows. His shoulder throbbed again, a dull ache left over from the war. He closed his eyes, letting the night's hush settle over him. Footsteps approached. He half expected Barristan, but instead it was Ned Stark, slipping away from the feast. Ned joined him at the window, gazing out at the city's rooftops. For a moment, neither spoke. At last, Ned said softly, "You seem tired." Arthur let out a thin laugh. "I am. The crown is heavier than steel." Ned nodded, regarding him. "Sooner or later, you'll need rest. You cannot stand vigil over the entire realm alone." Arthur closed his eyes. "I know. I will form a proper small council, fill it with men and women of integrity. For too long, kings have neglected that. They chose sycophants and fools, or worse, let men like Littlefinger and Varys hold power in the shadows. Ned glanced sideways at him. You plan to keep Varys around? Arthur's mouth set in a line. For now, yes, if only because he knows every whisper in this city. He could be an asset or a threat. I'd rather keep an eye on him. Ned grunted his agreement. There is wisdom in that, but watch him closely. Silence held for another moment. Then Ned looked away, down at the flickers of lanterns. When will you head west to deal with Tywin Lannister? Arthur sighed. That depends on these talks. If Kevin agrees to terms that can satisfy both sides, we might avoid a campaign. If not, he paused. The realm can ill afford another pitched war, but I will not yield to tyranny. Tywin must accept that the days of Lannister dominance are over. Ned's jaw tightened. You speak boldly. Tywin is cunning. There's no telling how he might strike. Arthur nodded, acknowledging the threat. I must be ready, yet I can't uproot half the realm again so soon. The harvest must be gathered. Winter's shadow looms. He turned to Ned. The North will see a harsher winter than us. Ensure your people are safe. I won't ask you to march south again if it can be avoided. Ned's face softened with gratitude. That's welcome news. I've seen enough war for one lifetime. They fell into a companionable silence. Two men bound by a history of crossed swords and shared secrets, each shaped by the weight of honor. The music from the feast drifted to them in faint tones. Torches sputtered in the hallway behind. A gentle wind rattled the shutters. Arthur finally spoke. Do you ever wonder if Rhaegar had won at the Trident, if none of this would have happened? If Robert would have died that day? Or if a truce could have been brokered? Ned stared at him. I wonder about many things, but it's no use looking back. We have the present to contend with. Arthur gave a small nod. Well said. They parted soon after, each returning to the swirl of the feast, wearing the masks of king and lord. Yet that quiet moment by the window marked a subtle shift. The North and the Crown, once mortal enemies, now found a precarious accord, held together by the shared desire to avoid more bloodshed. In the weeks following the coronation, negotiations with Tywin's envoys continued. Kevin proved courteous but firm. Oberyn Martell was prickly, but also mindful of Arthur's repeated instructions to seek compromise. Gradually, a framework emerged. Tywin would acknowledge Arthur as king without personally kneeling, provided House Lannister's privileges in the Westerlands were undiminished, and Jaime was formally absolved of any Kingsguard obligations. The question of Elia Martell's murder lingered, unspoken, casting a pall over the table. Oberyn occasionally made pointed references to the Mountain's butchery, but Arthur gently steered the conversation. He knew justice for Elia was dear to the Martells, but pressing it in these negotiations might torpedo any peace. Still, Tywin did not wholly escape accountability. Kevin admitted that Gregor Clegane was at large, no longer under direct Lannister command. Arthur insisted that, as part of the peace, the Lannisters must make no effort to shield Gregor if the crown demanded his arrest. Kevin, reluctant, finally agreed on Tywin's behalf. Justice might be slow, but the door was open. Arthur took that small victory as a sign of progress. By the end of the negotiations, Kevin prepared to depart with a draft of a formal treaty. He was not certain Tywin would sign it, but he believed it possible. At the farewell meeting, Kevin bowed stiffly to Arthur. I hope, for the realm's sake, that my brother sees reason, he said. Thank you for your courtesy, your grace. Arthur inclined his head. We all want peace, Lord Kevin. I expect your brother's reply by Raven soon. Thus, the Lannister party rode out of King's Landing in uneasy truce. Arthur turned his attention to domestic affairs. He took steps to relieve the burdensome taxes Robert had levied, hoping to foster goodwill. He directed funds toward rebuilding roads and wharves around the city. A simple decree allowed small folk to petition local justiciars with minimal fees, aiming to reduce corruption. It was an ambitious agenda, and some lords grumbled that the crown's coffers would not sustain such spending. Indeed, the treasury was in dire need, but Arthur believed that an investment in the people would pay off in loyalty and prosperity down the line. The greatest challenge remained unification. The Vale was an enigma, with Lisa Arryn in charge as regent for the young Robert Arryn. Rumor said she loathed strife and might keep the Vale isolated. The Iron Islands, under Balon Greyjoy, had not yet made any overt moves, but watchers along the coast warned that the Ironborn were restless. In the Stormlands, many lesser lords still seethed over Robert's death, but had grudgingly accepted Arthur. Stannis Baratheon was rumored to brood in Dragonstone, possibly hating the new king for the fall of his brother. Yet Stannis had made no open declaration of rebellion. The Targaryens across the sea remained a distant riddle. One bright spot was Dorne. Prince Doran Martell finally emerged from Sunspear to visit King's Landing, his gout-ridden legs carried in a litter. He politely congratulated Arthur on his coronation and praised the reforms. Oberyn, by contrast, walked behind with a swagger, making it clear he was watching for Lannister treachery. But they brought a strong retinue of Dornish knights, who paraded through the streets with vibrant pennants and a near-festival atmosphere. It reminded the city that the Dornish alliance had been crucial to Arthur's victory. Arthur welcomed Doran with warmth, promising that Dorne's grievances would not be forgotten. Doran nodded calmly. "We have waited long for justice," he said, his voice soft. "If peace with the Lannisters must come first, so be it. But do not think we have forgiven what happened to Elia and her children." Arthur bowed his head. "I have not forgotten. I will see what can be done without plunging us back into war." Doran smiled thinly. "Then Dorne stands with you, my king." As autumn deepened, the realm experienced a cautious stability. Trade resumed along major roads, and fewer soldiers patrolled the countryside. Small folk began to hope that the worst of the fighting was over. Still, everyone knew the threat of new conflicts remained, whether from Tywin's final decision, the Ironborn's raids, or the brewing storms in the North's harsh winter. During this lull, Arthur found time to slip away from the rigors of the court. Late one night, unable to sleep, he ventured into the Red Keep's Godswood, a small walled garden with a single weirwood that had stood for centuries. The Southerners seldom prayed to the old gods, but Arthur remembered how Ned Stark had done so. He found a quiet bench near the weirwood's pale trunk, its bark carved with the ancient sorrowful face. Moonlight spilled across the leaves. Arthur unsheathed Dawn and laid it gently across his lap. He closed his eyes, letting the garden's hush envelop him. In that stillness, he thought of the future, of Rhaegar, of Lyanna, of the child in Winterfell who might one day claim the throne if he so chose, of Daenerys and Viserys across the sea, and rumors of another Targaryen boy, of the threats that might rise in the far north beyond the wall, the wildlings, the others half-remembered myths. Arthur recalled old stories of a great darkness that once fell on the world, driven back by heroes long since gone. He wondered if the realm would ever see such times again. If so, would it be strong enough to endure? He prayed to whatever gods might be listening, old or new, that the realm would hold together under his watch. He had not taken the throne out of ambition, but out of a conviction that a knight's honor could guide a king's hand. Now, his every action carried the weight of that vow. Could he keep faith with the entire realm? Could he protect them from war, famine, or looming evils? Dawn's blade shone pale in the moonlight, as though it absorbed the night's faint glow. He rose, sheathing the sword with a soft rasp. Stepping away from the weirwood, he felt a measure of calm. If this was the burden the gods had placed upon him, he would not shrink from it. He walked back toward the keep, torches illuminating the passage ahead. The next day would bring fresh challenges, new demands, a swirl of politics and uncertainty. But Arthur Dayne, King of the Seven Kingdoms, Knight of the Morning, would meet them head-on, carrying his vow in his heart and his sword at his side. In the months to come, his rule would face further tests. Whispers of rebellion and shadowy intrigues would surface. Alliances would be forged and broken. Lords would jockey for favor, and the specter of winter would loom ever larger. Yet as the realm collectively held its breath, most men and women could not deny a flicker of optimism. They had a king who personally tended to their needs, who took his vow as seriously as any knight. Perhaps a new dawn truly had broken over Westeros. And so, On the nights when the wind rattled the shutters and the ravens cawed ominously from the rookery, the people of King's Landing and beyond told tales of the Sword of the Morning who had claimed the throne. Some called him the Night King, others simply Arthur the Just. Small folk sang ballads of a reign that might heal old wounds. Nobles debated whether a man so bound to chivalry could navigate the realm's treacheries. In castle halls and peasant hovels alike, men and women wondered if this was but another fleeting triumph of ideals over cruelty, one that might, for once, endure. High in the Red Keep, King Arthur Dayne strove each day to prove that it could. He rose before dawn, as was his custom, stepping onto a balcony that overlooked Blackwater Bay. The sky would be dark, stars winking faintly. Then the first threads of light would creep into the east, gilding the water's surface with molten gold. At those moments, the king allowed himself a small smile. Dawn always came, no matter how black the night. He believed the realm, too, could emerge from its darkness. If guided by honor, if protected by a sword wielded in righteous hands, if led by a king who was, above all else, a true knight.